Some call them Red Tails, others call them the Tuskegee Airmen, but in fact they were the 99th Pursuit Squadron of the United States Army. This group of young elite aviators made history by being the first African-American pilots to be accepted into the U.S. Army Air Corps. Their courage and experiences during the Second World War have been well documented in interviews, books, and even movies. But unlike their white counterparts, the 99th had two enemies to face: the Germans in the air and prejudice and racism on the ground. The fact that the 99th existed at all was remarkable, considering a 1925 War College study determined that blacks didn't have the intelligence to fly airplanes. Former combat pilot and Tuskegee Airman Colonel McGee remembers.
Well, we're physically qualified. Do service work, drive trucks, build roads, cook, dig ditches. But do anything technical, we didn't have the brains, fortitude, nor did we have the qualities for blacks and whites to work together successfully.
Even after the war, the Tuskegee Airmen, like the rest of African American veterans, faced the reality not much had changed. As a German POW, Colonel Jefferson recalls how he was greeted coming home.
Coming back through New York, flags waving, glad to be back, walking down the gangplank, and at the bottom of the gangplank, little white soldier standing there, whites to the right and niggers to the left.
So how did the 99th come to be? Well, it was a combination of world events, a chance meeting with a United States Senator, and the guts and never quit attitude of two young pilots, Dale White and Chauncey Spencer. Together, with the help of a small group of black aviators, they took the first steps on the journey to Tuskegee. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland and World War II began. President Roosevelt knew it wouldn't be long before America would be called upon to defend the free world. Roosevelt's fears would soon be realized. 2 years later, Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, and 3 days later, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, would declare war on the United States.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Most military experts agreed this would be the first war where air power could determine the outcome. Unfortunately, the U.S. military didn't have the resources to train all the pilots and support crews that were going to be needed. Their answer was to enlist the help of civilian aviation schools and colleges. As the Civilian Pilots Training Program, or the CPTP, began to take shape, the military compiled a list of institutions that were to participate. Most noticeably, no black colleges or schools were on it. Although there were only a handful of black aviation schools in the country, the students and instructors resented the fact they weren't given the opportunity to serve their country in the Air Corps. One of these schools was the Cornelius Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago, Illinois. Drawing inspiration from earlier black pilots like Eugene Bullard, who flew for the French Air Force in World War I, Coffey was determined to prove black aviators were every bit as good as their white counterparts. But Coffey wasn't to take on the task alone. His wife, Willa Brown, was right by his side. Willa was the first African-American woman to be licensed as a private pilot in the United States. She credited Bessie Coleman with inspiring her to fly. Bessie, like Eugene Bullard, received her pilot's license in France. At that time, blacks weren't allowed to obtain a license in the U.S. Nevertheless, she would later return to America and make a living barnstorming as a stunt pilot in air shows throughout the country. Willa became the administrator of the Coffey School of Aeronautics. Along with Coffey, their students and other black pilots associated with the school, they formed the National Airmen Association of America. Their goal was to promote awareness of black aviation and convince Congress to include them into the CPTP. They determined a multi-city flight that included a stop in Washington, D.C. would be a great way to further their cause. The Chicago Defender, an influential black newspaper, agreed and was willing to promote the event. Now all they needed was a plane, equipment, and fuel. It was Chauncey's father, Edward, who had long supported his son's dream to fly, that came through with the money to rent the plane and purchase the equipment.
I said, I'll call my father and my mother and see if we can get $1,000. So I talked with Pop, and Pop said, well, okay, I'll send you out there, special delivery, $1,000.
Still short on funds to buy fuel, Chauncey decided to solicit the help of some well-known businessmen in Chicago, the Jones brothers. Although they thought Chauncey's plan was risky, they donated $1,000, and on the morning of May the 8th, 1939, they took to the air. The plane Coffee had rented was a Lincoln Page biplane. Not only was it old, but badly in need of repair. Shortly after takeoff, the fuel line began to leak, and they were forced to land in Indiana to repair it. Once again, they were on their way, but the worst was yet to come. Less than an hour into their flight, there was a loud bang and the plane shook. The engine's crankshaft had shattered. They were forced to shut down the engine and the plane began to fall. If it wasn't for the instincts and quick reactions of Dale White, the situation would have been fatal.
All hell broke loose, and I could feel the engine cutting out. Dale pulled the switch on the engine. He side-slipped that plane right on down, and then the ship just pancaked right down.
After a hard impact and several bounces, they came to rest in a field belonging to Edward Miller near a small town in Sherwood, Ohio. Although Sherwood wasn't exactly the Deep South, the two black pilots weren't sure how the farmer would react as Miller approached them. Fortunately, he was more than welcoming. He drove them to town, bought them lunch, and helped them rent a room. They wired their friends in Chicago and told them they needed help. The NAAA came through and raised $54 to buy a new crankshaft. Coffee was soon on his way to repair the engine. 2.5 days later, the two undeterred pilots took off for Washington, D.C., one of the stops on their multi-city tour. Waiting at the airport was Edgar Brown, a well-known black lobbyist and union organizer. The following day, he took Dale and Chauncey to the Capitol, where Congress was holding hearings on whether to earmark funds to train blacks in the civilian pilots training program. It was there that a chance meeting with a junior senator from Missouri would leave a lasting impression on the two young pilots and plant a seed in the senator that would later bear fruit and help change the course of American history.
We met this man who said, "Hello, Edgar," talking to Edgar Brown. "Who are these two young men that you have with you?" Edgar said, "They're trying to get into the Air Corps." He said, "Well, why don't they join?" And then I spoke up and I said, "They don't want to allow Negroes into the Air Corps." He said, "Where's your airplane?" So we told him. He said, "How about me meeting you out at the Allegheny Airport at 3 o'clock? At that time, we didn't know his name was Harry Truman. He said, "Is that the plane you all flew from Chicago?" And I said, "Yes, sir, that's it. Would you like to take a flight?" He said, "No, but if you got guts enough to fly that thing from Chicago to here, I got guts to see that you do get into the Air Corps."
Senator Truman was true to his word, and a few months later, an anti-discrimination clause was added to the civilian pilots training program. The Cornelius Coffee School of Aeronautics was the first black aviation school to be selected, and the Tuskegee Institute was one of the 6 black colleges asked to participate. The significance of this can't be overstated. Not only was it a major step towards equality, it had a more profound meaning. It gave these African American aviators a chance to prove they had the intelligence, courage, and resourcefulness to compete with any race or nationality. And as the Red Tails would later demonstrate, not only did they compete, but they excelled. As Colonel Stewart recalls, the Tuskegee Airmen continued to impress even after the war.
The first Top Gun tournament of the United States Air Force was won by the 332nd Fighter Group of the Tuskegee Airmen. I was proud to be one of the members of the 3 pilots.
In 1941, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which would further integrate the defense industry. In 1945, Vice President Truman was sworn into office as president after the sudden death of Roosevelt. For 3 years, he tried to convince Congress to integrate the military. Unable to sway many of the Southern senators, he decided to act on his own. In 1948, he issued Executive Order 9981. It abolished discrimination in the military on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. As for the founding members of the National Airmen's Association of America, their journey continued. Coffee and his school would go on to train over 200 Tuskegee Airmen. After the war, he continued to train pilots and mechanics and even designed a carburetor heater that prevented icing and thus allowed airplanes to fly in all kinds of weather. In 1980, he was the first African American to have an aerial navigation intersection named after him by the FAA. Forever young, he flew until he was 89 years old. Willard Brown would later serve on the FAA's Women's Advisory Committee. In 2002, Women in Aviation International named Brown one of the 100 most influential women in aviation and space. Chauncey Spencer's fight for equality continued throughout the rest of his life. Chauncey was asked to write a prayer for unity by the United States Air Force chaplains. Drawing on a gift for writing passed down from his mother, Anne, who was a poet of the Harlem Renaissance, he wrote a prayer to brotherhood. It served as a light in the ensuing darkness of racial tensions that were mounting in the years after the war.
Almighty God, some of us are confused. You have said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Lord, I come. It's been nearly 200 years since men who wanted to be free fought for and died for American democracy. Nearly 100 years ago, our fathers were freed, a freedom that wasn't free. Lord, you saw the horrors of the Chicago, Washington.
His willingness to speak his mind led him to being branded a communist during the McCarthy era, resulting in his citizenship being suspended for over 2 years. Fortunately, he was later reinstated and he was cleared of all charges. He would later become police commissioner in the city of San Bernardino, California, and president of the local chapter of the NAACP, advocating for civil rights up until his death in 2002. As we look around today and see African American military pilots, commercial pilots, and even astronauts, we must remember and honor the brave individuals that were willing to take the first steps on a journey that continues today.